Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this is another week that's both shorter and not. There's fewer albums than usual because I made a big move. I'm still very much in the process of getting everything in gear, if you can't tell. But I also have a lot to say about the projects I am covering this week, more than I thought. So no more wasting time. Let's get on the pulse. So we've got 6 albums on the docket. Let's go back and talk about from Deftones, Ohms. Okay, we're doing this. Now, I've gone on at length that I never had an angry white boy phase, which meant in my teenage years I kind of missed the whole nu metal thing. I had to come back a lot later, mostly to find a lot of stuff I don't really like nowadays. Now, I've always been told that Deftones is the band that's okay to like, coming more out of that scene, even if they tilted towards alternative metal a lot on later projects, and my observation has always been, well, I get the appeal, but they just might not be for me. I can appreciate trying to hit the balance between serenity and a lot of pummeling heaviness as much as anybody. It's one of the big reasons I love black metal, after all. But I've never really found Deftones' tuneful side or any of Chino's vocals all that engrossing, which means that I've got rather odd taste when it comes to the Deftones I do mostly like. Funnily enough, I'm not all that crazy about White Pony in comparison with Saturday Night Wrist or Koino Yoken. So after Gore's adventures with some rather questionable groove patterns and some terrible mixing, I was curious to see what Ohms would deliver this year. And here's the thing, I have seen a lot of polarized opinions on this Deftones album, both from those who really like it and those who really don't. But as somebody who doesn't feel all that strongly either way on this band, I would argue this isn't bad, but it's absolutely flawed from being a better version of itself, and honestly feels a bit backwards looking. For one, Chino's vocal pickups sound very awkwardly compressed at best and kind of canned at worst. And they make the smooth/raw balancing approach the band tries feel even more forced than usual. Again, my preferences in this balance lie towards black metal, or at least Rollo Tomasi, and Deftones have never really gotten there in terms of their tone or scale of their sound. And while I don't really mind the choice of 80s inspired analog synthesizers or a few tones that are obviously borrowed from 90s prog and maybe even from the Smashing Pumpkins, I'm not really sure they complement the increasingly colorless and compressed alternative metal approach the band has here, especially with a lot of groove patterns leaning towards djent that feel like the sole concession to any sort of modernity. Ultimately, it just loops around to the larger problem that none of the melodies here really help or stick out for me, and the content really does not either. Thematically, Deftones has always kind of been diffuse and abstract in a lot of their writing, and it's just as true here. Vague aspirations towards self-improvement through a quasi-psychedelic angle towards finding some sort of inner balance and then going one's own way in a very hostile or borderline apocalyptic world, but more often than not it leads to a rather diffuse experience with cosmic imagery surrounding some sort of implied relationship where the discomforted mood, it's captured a lot more in the tone than a lot of the lyrics themselves. I guess the shame is that a lot of it circles around a very 90s inspired sense of nihilism, where my natural inclination falls more towards disinterest than outright anger or disgust towards it. Which is kind of awkward because the album seems pretty convinced that it's very captivating in its quest. Sorry, at the end of the day, I'm just not that wowed or really all that interested in this. So 5 out of 10, it's absolutely for a different audience, just not me. Next up from Sufjan Stevens, The Ascension. This is gonna sound bad, but I might as well lay it out there. There was something about the lead up to this project from Sufjan Stevens that was giving me political music circa fall 2016 vibes, where Sufjan Stevens clearly wanted to make some sort of statement, but was never gonna commit to the true firepower to call out real bad actors or spur real controversy, especially if the album is gonna wind up spiraling towards depression and nihilism along the way. Coupled with a lot of rumors that this album had a lot more parallels parallels with the Age of Odds than Michigan or Illinois or Carrie and Lowell. Oh look, I said last week I needed to give Sufjan Stevens' back catalog a quick re-listen to make sure I was up to speed and I remembered what I truly loved there. And after doing so, that set my expectations pretty low for this, I ain't gonna lie. And thus, while I did find this a bit better than I expected, I would absolutely not put this among his best. And let's get into some of the obvious criticisms that nearly everybody has. Let's get those out of the way first. Because initially, I found myself really sinking into the dreary electronics and all the shuddering grooves. The synths actually sound pretty rich this time. Sufjan's hushed, quivering delivery did convey credible despair, and I've always had a fondness for his falsetto. And there's some real melody and hooks, some cribbed openly from his older albums, but also some pretty potent percussion and a decent amount of bombast to a few songs. At the very least, he sounds more comfortable than a lot of the hit-and-miss experimentation of the Age of Odds. But that was before I noticed certain individual songs dragging really hard, and a long album started to feel very painfully bloated, often past the point of making a good point, and into, oh god, why didn't somebody stop him indulgence. Yes, I get why these pieces are this long. There is a point to it. Accentuate the crushing despair and bleakness underscoring the content. But that's a risk that can really backfire if the writing or composition stop holding up. And well, if you remember my review of Carrie and Lowell, where I talked about how the thematic arc was not so much about dealing with death, so much as a hard conflict with God and open questions of faith, yeah, the Ascension almost feels like an explicit continuation of that arc, this time with an even more confrontational and deeply rooted sense of pessimism, the sort that seems to come right before a complete loss of faith. Now, a lot of this is coaxed through a lot of glistening, abstract love songs that could easily represent the back and forth between him and his half-formed vision of a higher power or God, which also kind of hits the Christian music stumbling point in the metaphor, where he describes the affection as being a lot more physical and it just kind of gets weird. But it also exposes a larger issue in how the writing feels oddly barren this time around. Again, it's intentional, as Sufjan Stevens was intending this album to be much more direct. He wanted to strip this down, but coupled with even more spare arrangements, it leads to songs that are much more attempts at a meditative mantra than fully composed ideas. And if you all saw my Sev Deliza review, that doesn't always stick the landing for me, especially considering on the songs where he does get a little bit more detailed, he talks about taking anti-anxiety medication and then shitting his pants. I wish I was kidding there. Yeah, Gilgamesh takes some very on-the-nose references of ancient legends who are looking for immortality and failing. And you know what? There are some decent high-concept moments, especially by the time we get to the title track and Sufjan Stevens has clearly felt that he could change the world with his music, and then yet nothing really worked and a lot of his faith sputtered out. And let me make this clear, this is some tough existential stuff. Most of Kendrick Lamar's entire back catalog and discography, it's about the struggle to be a good person where all the systems are set up never to reward it. And Sufjan's angst is following a lot of the same territory, but the longer and more repetitive it feels, the more petulance creeps in. He finds fragile comfort in buzzwords and old axioms, but it doesn't penetrate to make something that feels more real, for at least for him. And it makes for a frustrating and not particularly great listen that I want to revisit all that much. And it's the feel of a desperate journey to climb a mountain that just circles around halfway up, never taking that leap of faith to get to the top. And as a whole, it's got potent moments, and it's more gripping in its subtleties than I initially thought. I think I like this more than I like the Age of Odds, but it's a project that gets in its own way too often, and it does fall short of greatness. So, strong 6 out of 10. I know it's going to come across as harsh, but I really want to like this a lot more than I do. Next up, from Anaal Nathrakh, Endarkenment. This is one of those acts I look at and I kind of wonder why folks want me to cover them. What Anaal Nathrakh have done over their lengthy catalog is try to diversify a raw black metal sound with some grindcore and industrial grooves, which in theory would make for a cool experiment to see how brutal and guttural they could push their sound. The problem is that Anaal Nathrakh have a formula at this point. They'll have an album that tries to add a little bit more greater tunefulness or expand their sound with some consistently mixed results before reverting back to the sort of utterly one-dimensional extreme metal that ultimately really runs together and is nowhere near as visceral or gripping as it thinks it is, made all the more ridiculous by any of the clean vocal passages that completely kill any sense of atmosphere for me. And thus, after going through a back catalog that, again, really ran together in terms of bricked out production, and especially a lot of the content, even more than Napalm Death did for me, I did not have expectations for this. And that honestly might have been the right approach. I mean, for one, at this point, Anaal Nathrakh has stripped out so much of the wild or texturally interesting grindcore or industrial elements in order to go for more straightforward, chugging, extreme metal with a lot of the clean-sung hooks that remain as borderline goofy and ridiculous as ever, which maybe could have worked if the drums and the bass weren't produced like ass. A lot of slappy kick drums, horribly formless cymbals, and with no commitment to real subtlety or atmosphere or dynamics, given all the howling, gurgling of the vocals and the guitars that are rammed right to the front of the mix. We have an album that can rarely build a potent or truly punishing groove section, made all the more jarring given how major key and bright more of the main melodies are. Sadly, none of those melodies, for as prominent as they are, really jump out at me all that much, which means that I've got to go to the content where Anaal Nathrakh are actually trying to get a bit more thoughtful. Yeah, you heard that right. Specifically in highlighting how we are moving away from expertise and enlightenment values towards an era of Endarkenment. And you know what, I'll admit, for a band that used to try so damn hard to be so much of nihilistic edgelords, it's kind of weird to see them trying to be a little bit more earnest in their condemnation of ignorance and totalitarianism on multiple levels, and even try to deconstruct and subvert fascist philosophy on create art though the world might perish, especially when they also have a song on the same album like Libidinous, a pig with cocks in its eyes. It tries to boil everything down to just pure ravenous lust. It also might wind up as one of the better songs here, not gonna lie. But you know what? That might be the root of the problem with this project. I can admire some attempts at lyrical nuance. It's certainly some ambitions I did not expect from this band. But if the delivery can't at least reflect a flavor of that nuance, I'm not sure if it's gonna resonate. So, strong 5 out of 10 might work for someone else. Not me, though. Next up, the self-titled album from Melanie C. I've gone on the record before that spin-off and side projects often get requested, but don't usually grab my attention that often, even from artists I like. And while I think the Spice Girls were fine in their time, Girls Aloud were better, but that's a different conversation, I was actually kind of shocked somebody actually requested I talk about Melanie C, the former Sporty Spice who actually has built a pretty sizable collection of solo albums. And then going back through them, well, this is gonna sound harsh, but she would not have been a pop star with the longevity she's had without being a member of the Spice Girls and having that name recognition, because I'm not hearing much at all that sets her above the crowd right now, even in UK pop. For one, her husky and not particularly strong delivery, it's really dependent on good production and arrangements that she hasn't always had. And for another, it's very easy to go through her back catalog and see a lot of trend chasing, where she's been putting out solo albums for over 20 years, and I can't really define a unique sound that is distinctively hers. Now, to her credit, she does tend to have some okay taste, which translates to the occasional scattered good song, think Stupid Game on the Sea or Better Alone from Beautiful Intentions, and that means I would rarely call her work bad so much as just unremarkable. So when she decides to go for one of her most straightforward dance pop projects in years, I'm left once again with the feeling that It's serviceable, but it's rarely more than that. I don't know why you would go to it otherwise. There is a song on this project called Here I Am, where Melanie C tries to highlight how long she has lasted and how some have called her too old to be in the game. But if I'm being brutally honest, I'm not sure her longevity is because of the strength of her material. Take her name off of these songs, we got some flagrant late 2010s mainstream textures and percussion and way too much Dua Lipa worship. But I'm not even sure it gets around how flat of a presence Melanie C is in trying to convey any sort of emotion, which means that when she gets a co-writer like Shura on songs like Good Enough, I'm stuck wondering why I'm not listening to Shura instead. What's odd is that an album like this is set up to drive at least some sort of tension. Beyond the bargain barrel empowerment cliches, the defining emotions of the writing on this album seem to be a lot of frustration and panic and dissatisfaction. And while that can lead to a couple good songs, and there are a few here, it never really quite matches the emotions on a lot of the smoother grooves, which are more relaxed. Again, if you stuck around long enough that you're a fan, this will probably satisfy you, but in a pretty strong year for pop, it doesn't stand out. Strong 5 out of 10, just not much here. Next up, from Roisin Murphy, Róisín Machine. Now here's an artist who's been in my back catalog for a while, a name that I saw crop up on a lot of year-end lists in the 2000s and occasionally the 2010s, but I never really got around to discussing her. Now, if you recognize Róisín Murphy, it either comes from her tenure with the trip-hop group Moloko or her critically beloved first 2 albums in the mid-2000s. But then label troubles at EMI derailed her career really hard, and she went indie for 2 projects in 2015 and 2016. To be fair here, that was probably inevitable. Her approach to pop leans a lot more towards the understated but playful side that interjects a lot of jazzy chord structures, some eclectic instrumental choices, and even touches of glitch into her sound that once you wrap your head around the tones can be really damn intriguing. Get a little bit more of a Regina Spektor vibe, but a lot more dance-worthy. She's got a lot more electronic and amazingly catchy on 2007's Overpowered, and you know what, without the career detour, she probably would have landed some real hits in the club boom, same way Robin and LaRue did, but we wouldn't hear from her again until the mid-2010s, where her material got a lot more lengthy and dance-focused, full of fractured gloss and darker edges, tempering a lot of the old whimsy. But now, 4 years after those, what do we have? Well, a retro-leaning slice of hazy new disco. In other words, if you were one of those people over 10 years ago who got overly annoyed by Overpowered's accessibility, prepare to be even more here. But what's all the more frustrating is that I might find myself closer to that group than I would like. I've already seen some comparisons to the recent Robin and Jessie Ware projects, which I am sure will satisfy a target audience, but it's also hard to ignore just how Murphy might just fall in the middle between her older, jazzy quirkiness and the current new disco scene, and I'm not really sure that's a compliment for her, because she brings some of the flattened grind and the darker edges of her 2010s work, but with a much more conventional compositional structure and restraint that doesn't quite have the same flair that she used to have that was so interesting. Yeah, it's all understated and tasteful in a sweeping 80s inspired way, which might have been one of the hallmarks throughout her career, true, but she used to have this sly, quirky flair that I used to love that doesn't quite disrupt what we get here. In a way, it kind of reminds me of what one of her artistic descendants, Lady Gaga, released with Chromatica this year, which was a return to form that feels a lot safer than it should. And like with Gaga, there's a slight undercurrent of darkness that helps it hold traction a little longer than you would expect, specifically coming through a lot of the lyrics. But where Lady Gaga was confronting her own instabilities and weaknesses, Murphy is looking to catch a much broader net here. There's a hunger that drives a lot more of the project, where she projects a command of the scene, but the intriguing moments really come when her own emotional response kicks in and might even get the better of her, either from the reemergence of old flames or her newfound interests that she did not expect. It adds some cracks to the slick stylism that runs throughout the album, and ultimately, well, I wound up liking this a fair bit, even if I am cooler on this overall in comparison with some of her older work, specifically out of the 2000s. And as such, you know what, it's a solid 7 out of 10. If you like this brand of new disco, you're gonna have a lot of fun with this. Check it out. And finally, from 21 Savage and Metro Boomin, Savage Mode 2.
Beat niggas up in the club. I know she around for the money, but act like she loyal, I don't for the love. I'm so rich, get bored, might wake up, buy me a car just cuz.
I didn't review the first Savage Mode in 2016, but can any of you blame me that much? I can make the argument that 21 Savage took a pretty substantial leap between that project and now. Hell, he literally titled an album, I Am Greater Than I Was. And going back to that first Savage Mode, it's not particularly good. Extremely spare production from Metro Boomin, which might work if 21 was trying to be menacing or more murderous, but his flows felt painfully basic, and more than a few were just focused on a lot of bargain barrel mainstream rap material, which can be a bit of an awkward fit for him depending on the content. That said, 21 Savage did make that leap in terms of his flows and style, and Metro Boomin's has had more consistent success with me recently, so I wanted to check this out, and I'll say this. Even if it's exactly what you would expect from 21 Savage in terms of the content, and honestly a bit less forward-thinking than he was on I Am Greater Than I Was, this is clearly going for more of a bass, style over substance vibe, and I thought it turned out alright. And not just because they somehow got Morgan Freeman, of all people, to provide narration for the entire project in order to ramp up that bombast. Paradoxically, this is a project that tries to take advantage of 21 Savage's more expressive and diverse flows that he's developed, but also winds up highlighting some of his limitations, because the softer the production gets, more often than not, the less he fits on it. Yes, I put Mr. Right Now in that category with that Drake verse that's all kinds of questionable. Yeah, SZA tried to save your ass here, but Drake, come on. And then there's that odd old school bounce on the horns on Steppin' On that kind of falls close to that too. The tracks I like more are the more spare, haunted trap crackles of Runnin', Glock in My Lap, Snitches and Rats, Many Men, Brand New Draco, even though the 50 Cent interpolation on Many Men it's not as good as the late Pop Smokes. But I think what worked on Without Warning with Offset is when we get those solid creepy vibes, and when they follow here, the songs turn out well. Again, it's one of those projects where not all the experiments quite connect. My Dog takes a while to stabilize its flow, and 21 Savages is one of those guys where it's kind of weird to see him address his haters in his bars. But what I found more interesting was how the mood shifts by the final couple songs. The very bleak and haunted tones get a bit more melancholic and fractured, and on cuts like R.I.P. Love and Said and Done, we get a glimpse behind the blood mask to something that's more heartfelt that can kind of cut through some of the numbness. Even with the glittery R&B samples by the end, there's enough hard foundation in order to make it work, and 21 really surprised me there. So at the end of it all, I find it hard to call this great, as I just wish there was a little bit more to it in the content, and I'm still not all the way on board with 21 Savage, as he does have some real limitations as a rapper. But you know what, it certainly is solid. Solid 7 out of 10. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Still trying to get this set up here, really as much as I wanted to. Again, I moved and it's been a bit of a hassle unpacking everything, but I appreciate you all being patient for that. And hey, if you want to watch a particularly long review I put out my top 100 albums of the 2010s. It's a long-ass video, and I really hope you all check it out, because I put a good 6 months of work into it. I think it's something special. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in helping support this channel or get albums on my increasingly lengthy schedule, link to my Patreon is right over there. Again, feel no obligation. Tough times for everybody right now, I get it. But hey, if you want to, options available. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time. Like, 'cause I was born overseas, these motherfuckers ain't gonna spray. Put up in your hood, nigga, 911.